you very much, Sarah. And just a little note to everybody, we're just beginning to record the session. So I think it's just a courtesy these days to tell people that you're recording. So thank you everyone for coming to this session. I'm going to start off by thanking our participants. I recognised some familiar names from the talking circle earlier this morning. So for some of you, it's welcome, and for others, it's welcome back. Welcome back. So a little bit about me. My name is Bill Cope. I work at the University of Illinois. You might be able to tell from my accent that I'm not originally from Illinois. I'm originally from Australia. And I've been involved with these Common Ground conferences for a long time now, where we're trying to build this idea of knowledge community, where we deal in a cross-disciplinary way with challenging issues of our times, in which case, ageing is certainly one of those very important issues, become kind of even more critical and difficult and important, and perhaps even interesting in this COVID crisis as well. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our plenary speaker for today, Professor Norah Keating. She's a social gerontologist whose theoretical and empirical research has created evidence that's challenged discourses, influenced policy on the global, social and physical context of ageing. She has placed this work on the international stage through the Global Social Issues in Ageing Forum, which fosters collaboration and critical thinking about ageing at the interfaces of regional issues and global trends. Professor Keating holds academic appointments in 3 different world regions: at the University of Alberta in Canada, at Swansea University in the United Kingdom, and the Northwest University in South Africa. She's a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences, the Gerontological Society of America, and the UK Academy of Social Sciences. In 2017, she was awarded the International Association of Gerontology and Geriatrics Presidential Award for the global reach of her international work. So we're very, very honoured to have you today, Professor Keating, and also the people who will subsequently listen to this recording when we post it into our ageing and society community. So thank you very much for being here, and I'm now handing over to you.
Great, and thank you so much, Bill. And I was going to say, I'd hoped to be able to say welcome to Vancouver. I live in a valley about 400 kilometers east of Vancouver. And we had really hoped after this session, we'd all go out, have a coffee together and talk about some of these global issues. So we'll do our best given our virtual connections. And I must say, I feel very much at home in the kind of context you're talking about, Bill, where people get together across disciplines and across regions to talk about big social issues in aging. And that's what I want to talk about today, to talk about our roles in creating knowledge to address some of the big challenges presented to us by the current global context in aging, and to highlight the beginning of this WHO Decade of Healthy Aging, to say that I think it's more important than ever for we researchers to work across regions and disciplines to address some of these issues. Now, whether evidence is a good intervention to really change the world is something that we'll discuss over coffee later, but I'll certainly raise in my presentation to you today. COVID-19 certainly has given rise to much thinking about connectedness and about isolation. It's highlighted both and our inequalities, and focused our attention, as the title of your conference says, on ageism, on tensions, and on inequality. Our conversations about connectedness and about being all in this together were certainly in evidence in the early phases of the pandemic. It's interesting how our language has shifted, though, to issues about weaknesses and inequality, I think in part as our weeks and months deepen and we see our isolation and how there are inequities in the way we've been able to deal with it. Fairly early in the pandemic, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, talked about the pandemic as a public health emergency, but also as an economic crisis, a social crisis, and a human crisis. And he argued that against this backdrop, we're seeing other unacceptable things going on: rising ethno-nationalism, populism, authoritarianism, and a pushback against human rights in some countries. He went on to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals and how they are aimed at making societies more inclusive. And those are the things I want to talk to you about today, about how these big global aspirational documents can help us focus and target our research for it to have the most impact. And I want to highlight three very briefly today, all of which are relatively new, all of which are hugely challenging, and especially these days. The United Nations certainly has been instrumental in redefining some of the values and discourses around inclusion and citizenship. Its agenda for sustainable development has as its mission leaving no one behind. The World Report on Aging and Health, released in the same year, focuses specifically on what this means for older adults. It takes as its major premise that older persons should expect to live in ways that are important to them. Both, interestingly, place the onus on governments to reduce inequalities that lead to exclusion. Both have been adopted by many countries around the world. They are aspirational. We must neither be naive about their uptake nor dismissive about our ability to make a difference in reference to them. The World Report on Aging and Health signaled the importance of aging and older people in the agenda to leave no one behind. It also marked a substantial shift in perspectives on health, now talked about as the ability to be and to do what you most value. Being free of disease or infirmity is not the major criterion, and really it's about context that makes a difference in the quality of older people's lives. There are three constructs that they use in that report that I want to highlight briefly, because I'll come back to them as I talk about what I see as an important research agenda for all of us to take forward. And the three are these: intrinsic capacity, which they describe as the mental and physical capacities that a person can draw on. Environment, which are the work that many of us are involved in, that they describe as home, community, and broader society, and argue that being able to live in environments that support and maintain your intrinsic capacity is the key to healthy aging. In our language, in my language, certainly as someone who's interested in context of aging, I think we can talk about healthy aging resulting in well-being, an indicator of the fit between personal resources and contexts. We also, I think, need to pay attention to the idea that fit needs to be recalibrated over time as people and environment change. It's the decade of healthy aging that is meant to bring all this together. In it are a set of action items, some of which are about research, some not. And it's on these that I think we may wish to hinge our research agenda for the next decade. Now, I want you to look at these as I go through them, because they're an interesting set of actions. And as I've looked at them, I wonder how many of these, or I think about how many of these have research implications. And here are the 10. It's also important to note as we look at these 10 action items that many of them come from long-standing WHO interests in health systems, in ageism, in age-friendly communities. So the list is not perhaps a surprise. The question that comes up for me is which of these help inform a research agenda? I would argue, as I've looked at them, that there really are 3 sets of action items, and I want to talk about those briefly. The first are actions around policy and practice. What do governments need to do? What legislative or programmatic changes do they need to make? Others, I think, are about research or have implications for research in terms of what are the knowledge gaps that we need to fill. And the third one that I think we don't talk about enough, but seems to me is critically important, is how do we, as scholars, connect up to create the scholarship that is going to be important to inform these agendas, and how do we do that now? I don't know about the rest of you, but I have not been on an airplane for 6 months. So here are some of the ones that I think relate to policy and practice. They are things like supporting country planning and action. I know here in Canada, we have seemed to struggle mightily against doing something which seems as straightforward as creating a national action plan on aging. Issues around health systems and how they are focused or should be focused on needs of older people also seem to have been very resistant to intervention. While we talk about health systems focused on the needs of older people, systems are the ones that often take priority. Similarly with others, laying the foundation for long-term care systems often mutes the voices of family members who in fact are the major providers of long-term care. The campaign to combat ageism and the one on global networks for age-friendly communities are reasonably long-standing and I think have got some traction, although I expect Liat Ayalon may have some comments about how well we're doing on combating ageism, and similarly on age-friendly communities. If we had more time, I would talk to you about how I take objection to the agenda item under make the economic case for investment in healthy aging. It seems to me that the argument that the UN is making is around a well-being campaign, and that the well-being of people surely is an important goal, as is GDP. So for those of you who do policy research, it seems to me that one of the big issues is how do we become engaged in questions around who's deserving of full citizenship, and how is it that the values that are held in different societies make it more or less possible for people to be engaged, for older people to be engaged as full citizens. One of the difficulties that I think we see with policy is that values are often not explicit. So while for since 1969, when Robert Butler first talked about ageism, we have talked about engaging older people as full citizens. We still have much workplace discrimination. We still have places, including the World Health Organization, where people must retire at a certain age. So those values that are powerful, that drive the actions that we take, often are not explicit and are hard to make explicit. Governments are remarkably resistant to taking up action items that don't fit with current economic or social agendas. One of the ones in my own area of work that I find particularly troublesome are our values about families, which often are, again, in the backdrop, but are ways in which, in my country, we have tended not to develop fully comprehensive long-term care systems because we count on family members to do that caring work, but are quite reluctant to support them. In terms of our filling of knowledge gaps, there are a number of these items that I think have implications for knowledge that we might need to create, but they don't directly relate to knowledge gaps. So promoting research addressing needs of older people, I would argue perhaps needs to be shifted towards research addressing the goals of older people. If in fact we're thinking about healthy aging as being able to be and to do what you most value. It also, I think, increases the likelihood that older people are seen as citizens rather than burdens, with all kinds of medical, social, economic needs that we can't possibly fill. Similarly, on issues around healthy aging, I think one of the big agenda items for us is whether or not we really agree on what is healthy aging and where physical health and social connectedness and material resources might come together. What are the metrics for healthy aging? How will we know when we're there? And importantly, I think these days, how might different cohorts of people be more or less likely to achieve healthy aging? We know that during this pandemic and probably following from it, there are going to be huge economic impacts that will have differential outcomes for people of different ages. So aging across the life course really is an important piece of this global agenda. On the Age-Friendly Communities Network, that's been a WHO priority for many years. And I think an important one in that communities have taken up these ideas of making their places accessible to all. And there's been a whole parallel body of research on age-friendly that has clarified what we mean by age-friendly communities. I see challenges around the world in local governments, however, being able to really rise to the occasion. In the UK, for example, there was legislation a few years ago that gave family carers the right to an assessment of their own needs. And yet, as funding has tightened up and less money has gone to local governments, the ability to actually meet that policy goal is diminished. So we have work to do both on filling research gaps and on the policy implications that follow from those. So here's my first attempt, and this is first attempt as of this week, on developing a research agenda for a decade of healthy aging. I think we as researchers need to do this. There are going to be research calls that are focused around some of these decade agenda items. Our ability to kind of claim the space and craft the agenda, I think, is an important one. I have crafted the agenda around some of the language, both of the decade of healthy aging and of the World Health Organization's global report. And I show to you a photo that I think epitomizes what to be, I hope we might gain in all of this. These are two friends of mine. Ailey is 20. Her grandmother, Natalie, is 92. They are both pictured here modeling clothes from a local design firm that is quite excited about the fact that they have a fairly big age spread in potential customers for their fashion items. So this permission is shown with, this photo is shown with permission of both of them. So in a few minutes, let me walk you through this, and I'd be particularly interested in your comments. The purpose of this agenda to me is about focusing some of our global work around these big items, and particularly the intersectionalities among them. If you recall, intrinsic capacity is a term WHO uses, and they use it for those physical and mental health resources inherent in an individual. Now, we've got huge bodies of research on both physical and mental health. And the question for me in all of these is, where are the gaps? And I wonder in this case if the gaps really are about the intersections of physical and mental health with the context in which people live. We know, for example, that context can actually change disease progression. There's literature on prevention and delay of expression of some chronic illnesses, but also emerging literature on improvement in some illnesses that we thought were chronic and inevitably degenerative. So some of that work, I think, needs very much to be part of this agenda. I wonder, though, if we've got the whole set of characteristics within intrinsic capacity. Should we, for example, have sex as part of this? We know that women live longer than men. And we also know that overlaying sex are gender issues that can make a huge difference, that can probably override any inherent physical advantage that women have by virtue of gender discrimination. The Decade Action Plan lists age-friendly environments as physical, social, and economic. I've already touched briefly on societal attitudes and values, which I think are critically important. Certainly ageism is one that has been brought to the top of our list, but I wonder about other isms, about sexism, about racism, about why older people have been excluded from the Me Too movement around the world and from discussion about gender exploitation, about why in Canada we seem to continue to word elder is an indication of high esteem in which older persons are held. So I think there's more to be done around societal attitudes and values, but I think they also need to be highlighted in our agenda. And finally, the social connections, which aren't clearly part of the agenda for a decade, family connections, social isolation have been huge issues during the pandemic. We do a lot of work in these areas. We need to make sure they're part of these environments. And finally, life courses of healthy aging. How do we really highlight the accumulation over time of advantage and disadvantage? How do we know when we're there? How do we understand well-being? And when we've got what in my language I would call a person environment fit, that we continue to recalibrate so that the places and environments where I live, where Ailey lives now, will work for her in a new way, perhaps, when she's her grandmother's age. So let me finish up by talking very briefly about that final issue, which I think is really important for all of us. And that is, how do we foster and maintain our global connections, particularly at a time like this when we are not in contact with each other? If we're going to have global priorities on some of these big issues, we need to be talking to each other. Because while we may share these priorities around things like well-being, the solutions have to be grounded in the places where people live and where we as researchers do our work. Our capacities need to be built at all levels and with people at all career stages. I show you here a photo that was just taken just a few months ago, where we brought together a group of early career scholars from all parts of the world to talk about social issues in aging. That kind of capacity building I worry about now, and about how these early career scholars get onto these platforms where we're having these conversations. Similarly, for those of us who've been in the business for a while, I think it's important for us to really have these conversations, particularly between the global north and the global south. So let me finish by saying that this is my aspiration as well, and that we over the next decade will begin to achieve some of these reductions in inequalities and in inequities, the things that can be changed, and that we will achieve some further advancement in people being able to be and to do what they most value. So I'll look forward to our conversations, and certainly to hearing from people if they'd like to get in touch with me. So thank you very much.
I've just, Sarah, how much time do we have for a Q&A now, for a little ongoing conversation before the next commitment, next session?
Actually, until the afternoon, this is the last session, so we actually have plenty of time, officially 30 minutes.
Great. Yeah, thank you very, very much for that, that very sort of, all-encompassing talk that highlights the importance of these issues for us. There's a very, I think a very important and tricky question that Peter's asked in the chat box, which I will read out because when this recording happens, the chat is not visible to the people who listen to the recording. So I'm going to read out Peter's question. And it's, let me share with you a great concern as it relates to global action and its enormous value. The global network is rapidly fraying given the soaring nationalism that's occurring in so many nations. We even lose the connectivity offered by the internet and social media as sites are being monitored and walled off. Our ability to compare, gather and share is very much at risk. The most important task, I think, will be to have, will be country by country to raise support between knowing and professional activists. So yeah, that's a big question, or it's a big comment, a big issue.
It's a huge issue, and I've just done some writing about that. In fact, just last week, and I could send it to people. I wrote a commentary on how we, as members of international professional organizations, can continue to work together to do the kinds of things that we think we need to do around these global agendas. I entirely agree that a whole set of inequities have arisen around those of us who wish to be engaged in this scholarship, who don't have internet access, who are in countries in which our ability to freely exchange ideas is truncated, And I think these are huge issues that we really must confront. Absolutely, we need to work within our countries. I guess I continue to be a strong believer that we need to find ways, and sometimes it's ways to work within regions rather than to work within a global network to come together around these ideas. So for example, this past week, I had a request from a regional chair of the International Association of Gerontology and Geriatrics to help them do an online kind of masterclass conversation within that region around some of these issues. So it's extraordinarily difficult times, and I in no way negate the difficulty that scholars are having engaging with these agendas. I can add one more thing. For those of us who live in the Pacific time zone, there's also the tyranny of the time zone. I work a lot with people in Europe and in Africa, and it's 8 or 9 or 10 hours later there. So I've become somewhat of a middle of the night person. So thank you. It's an important question, Peter.
Does anybody else have some questions? You can either speak them, turn on your microphone and speak them out loud, or you can put them into the chat box and I will read them out from there.
I had one that's left over from an earlier session. Oh my goodness, excuse my telephone making noise, that I'd like to share. I noticed that, and I'm not quite sure how this fits into your research plan, Norah, but I'm thinking as I'm going. Laura.
May I ask who's talking, please? Because I don't have you on my screen.
Oh, that's interesting. It's Margaret Oldfield.
Oh, thank you.
Hi. A presenter in an earlier session talked about the problem in the United States in her media discourse analysis of family members being consulted about people living in institutions, in nursing homes, and the restrictions on them and the restrictions on family members visiting and so on. And the family members' voices were far more in evidence in the media than the voices of people living in the institutions. This is something I've noticed in my research on what it's like to live in an institution, and in my presentation on family members and restrictions on them and visiting. And I've also noticed that this happens a lot in the media with the voices of family members being heard about their experiences with dementia, and it's their point of view, but it's taken as the truth of the experience of people who actually have dementia. And we're not hearing from those people. In many cases, they communicate differently without words. It's more difficult to do research with them. We have to focus on new methods that don't require the use of words. Do you have any comments on this problem of representation of people with dementia and people in institutions as relates to your comment on long-term care planning? And I think there was something else. Oh, people's needs, people's goals, the goals of older people rather than the needs as assessed by family members, for example.
We've been a long time, Margaret, I can see you now, sorry about that. We've been a long time talking about voice and invisibility of people. And I think your example just highlights how far we have yet to go. That, if you have a particular mental or physical condition, if you are past a certain age, you really aren't a full citizen. That someone else becomes a proxy for your voice. And that's why this whole idea of needs versus goals. Maybe you could decide based on my physical status that I need a walker, but you can't decide for me, I hope, that what I really want is to model for a designer clothing company. My friend Natalie uses a walker. And she put that walker aside and she said, Norah, if you're going to use a picture of me, this is the one I want you to use. So it's her voice in that picture. I don't know how we I mean, I guess we've made some progress, Margaret. When I first did research in care facilities with people with dementia, the people running the care facility where we were doing our work would not allow us to take any pictures because they don't wish to be seen that way. So I think we've made some improvement, but we're not there yet. I don't have any great solutions, but I think finally we're seeing some of those issues about who's visible and who has a voice.
I think
Thank
that's
you.
interesting, and I too like the concept of, you know, seeing what people's goals are rather than their needs. And one of the things that is encouraging, though, is sort of a patient and public participation. And we have been putting together a research funding bid, and that's involving residents from the nursing home in the research group.
Mhm.
You know, they're not being the researched, they are part of the group. But also, interestingly, on the news this morning, there was the news that a woman of 104 who lives in a nursing home has made a YouTube clip appealing to the government not to stop her having her visitors.
Ah.
So,
Mhm.
you know, I think we've still got a long way to go, but when I look back over my career, you know, in 30, 40 years, there have been some huge improvements, but we cannot be complacent.
No, I agree with you, Angela. And more, you know, we're having these conversations and trying to get past this othering that that we've done for such a long time. So, and I expect that those of us of the baby boom generation will not quiet observers of others deciding what. So, so maybe there's some hope here.
Yeah, I think we'll be more vocal.
We will not be removed.
Way.
There are a couple more questions now that are coming from the chat box, but I might actually ask they would like to ask the question. If not, I can read them out. So, first one is Mary Clancy.
Hello. Thank you very much for a very comprehensive presentation and also for your dedicated service. I just want to ask a broader question. I mean, what value do you think today old people have in our society? You know, there's a sense, particularly with this pandemic, that they're disposable. There's a sense of, here in America, at least in some quarters, even at the very top, that they're just collateral damage. I mean, they're old, they're going to die, they take up resources. And how do we, you know, that they can't even be grandparents anymore, you know? So has there been a shift as a consequence of the pandemic? That's what I'm asking about the way we value people after a certain age. I think it's about 70.
Well, I think I don't know as a result of the pandemic. We're certainly having these conversations a lot more, Mary, as a result of the pandemic. I guess the other thing I would say, though, is there has been this kind of insidious intrusion of those of us who are over 65 into the mainstream. You invited me, I was invited to do a plenary talk.
Right.
And so I think I think we're getting there, you know, when you think about the people of influence. Look at the US presidential election and the age of the contenders. Now, whether you all kinds of political comments about those contenders, but I think that age has becoming, for those of us who are privileged in other ways,
Right.
is becoming somewhat less
All right.
important.
One of the things that,
Yeah, go ahead, Angela, sorry.
one of the things that has become apparent in the UK is when the government came out with the directive that the over 70s, regardless of anything, should self-isolate for 12 weeks, it became clear that a lot of our voluntary organisations and people that run the food banks were in danger of closing.
Exactly.
Because this is the group that is actually our volunteers and the backbone of our caring.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
No.
so I think it has shone a spotlight, sometimes in a very positive way, on the great contribution that people in their 70s, 80s and 90s, they're still carers.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, and I think, the Prime Minister backed away from that rather rapidly, but it was still there at the beginning, wasn't it?
It was. And of
Yeah.
course, he's got to think about the grey vote.
Uh-huh.
Let me make a commentary this is from an 81-year-old in your midst this morning. We need to, I think, as our ability to get global information may shrink, I think one of the things we as professionals can do something very important in each one of our communities. And that really is to look at our community. In my case, it's a town of 22,000 people in Connecticut, a wealthy town. 16% of us are, 3,600 of us are 60 years of age or older. But to take a look at what skills and what expertise we have and how we can improve our individual condition. And I think what I encourage my contemporaries to do is that we need to examine our environment. We need to examine it first for ourselves. We need to look at ourselves. And we need to look at ourselves with both a microscope and a telescope. We need to look at ourselves from within as we are, and from the periphery as others see us. Right. And then we need to do the same for our family, our community, our local political leaders, and our media. And if we get this perspective, we can truly create an intergenerational environment that, as our lifespans lengthen, is so much more needed. We're not disposable. We're more valuable, actually. And this is the way we need to act. While we do our work on a global scale, as I said, if each one of us, thousands or hundreds of thousands of professionals around the world did this, I think we would start to develop much more stronger and understanding communities.
I agree, Peter, and I think it's these everyday conversations that really help us reflect on and perhaps refine our values about age and aging and generations. And these are relatively new conversations that we're having. And, it's fine for us to write our papers, and we do that. But we also live our lives in our small communities. And I live in a small community here in British Columbia. And I'm with you entirely. These are the conversations I have all the time with my friends and my neighbors and of people of all ages. The nice thing about communities is that they're age diverse. And so, yes, I think everywhere we can have those conversations with people in nursing homes, with our neighbors next door, it makes a big difference.
I think that's very true. And I think I love the analogy of thinking of the population like an orchestra. Rather than looking at their age, you look at who can play the fiddle, who can play the piano, and what Peter said, let's look at what contributions, let's look at ourselves under the microscope and the telescope. And one of the things that was quite scary this morning on the news was the fact that young people are getting a lot of blame in the UK for spreading the coronavirus through house parties. And 2 students were interviewed at Glasgow University, and they were asked by the reporter, is there anything during Freshers Week you wish you hadn't have done? Trying to catch them out. And they said, we wish we hadn't gone and done our laundry because student accommodation is so cramped and the laundry room is so cramped and you cannot do social distancing, but you have to wash your clothes. And so this kind of idea that we can go the other way, that the young are feckless, we shouldn't have these old, young, and I really do think we should be much more intergenerational and look at the skills and contributions of each individual or communities.
I've been thinking a lot about generations, apropos your comment, and we've got a couple of issues about generations that I think also have been highlighted. One is these cohorts of people who have been differently affected by something like COVID. Every group, from those who went through the generation in the 1930s down to those whose education and entry into the labor force may have been truncated. I think we need to track the generational inequalities that may flow from all of those. And then there are the family generations and how families are working together or not. One of the things that COVID has highlighted is when people are isolated together in households, that can bring to the top tensions in family relationships as well as positive and supportive issues. And I think our values about families need to constantly be looked at, because we tend to veer from a romantic idea that this is the place where you're always loved and cared for, to often in aging are concerned about abuse and about elder abuse. And families are as diverse as people. So there are lots of, I think, research and policy and everyday issues that come out of COVID, for sure.
Here's another idea for research. And I'm not sure how much this applies outside of North America, but let me know, people on the call who are not in North America. In North America, there's among people with disabilities, of whom older people are a part, but generally not seen as people with disabilities. I'm a disability scholar, so I'm very familiar with that way of looking at things as well, and trying to apply these notions to gerontology and this aging studies. There's been years ago, and still in some places, people with developmental disabilities, or what could be called cognitive impairments, which are also connected to dementia, or not connected to dementia rather, but people with dementia have cognitive impairments. Younger people with developmental disabilities or cognitive impairments used to be put in large institutions. This still happens in some cases in North America, but generally there's been, since the 1960s and 70s, a deinstitutionalization movement. Instead of having people living in large institutions, people are now living in community, in group homes, in supported apartments, increasingly still with their families, because the money is not there the way it was decades ago to build alternative community supportive housing. But that whole movement could be an inspiration for looking at the long-term care sector and the interaction between family members, and the idea that people, even frail older people with cognitive impairments, should be living in the community, not in large institutions, because as we've seen, one of the issues that comes out in the media about the large congregate housing institutions of nursing homes is that they are focuses of infection, because people are living close together. If people were living further apart in the community in smaller places, this might not have been an issue. But beyond the infection control aspects, there's quality of life aspect. So I'm wondering, Norah, if you've seen that side. I noticed there was someone from Seniors for Social Action Ontario wrote a letter to the Toronto Star a few weeks ago, making that suggestion. She had been herself a developmental services worker for her whole career, so she knew the connection. She saw the connection that I'm seeing. Have you seen that connection, Norah? Do you have any comments?
Yes, yes. And I think that one of the pieces of a big research agenda, Margaret, could be to take another look at the question of age-friendly communities. I mean, we're all living in places, and think about age-friendly for whom, and look at both the goals of the person and where they are in their life course, and the resources of communities. I'm working with a group in Alberta right now that are building coalitions in small rural communities, particularly to support older people with dementia. And what they're finding during COVID is that people's energies have been drained away from the general supportiveness that an older person needs to more acute demands. And so the ability of communities to support, particularly small rural communities, is quite fragile. And I think some more focus both on the person and their goals, but really on how communities are evolving, what the demands are on them, and how can we really get this fit is an area that I think would be very useful moving forward. We can learn things from the disability movement, which has been, I think, all along, one in which people are talking about their goals, their will, reason to be independent, as opposed to the aging movement where we've looked at needs and burdens and so on. So I think there has been different language and maybe we can learn from it. I don't want to abandon communities, however, by pulling away all the formal services and saying, there you go, you're now living in community. And good luck with that. So that's the risk.
I've got another comment here from Ivica, who I'll just read it out. Who said, I'd like to appreciate how you highlighted the need for creating a global network as well as the importance of addressing goals rather than basically focus on strength perspective.
I'm sorry, Bill, you're breaking up. I'm having a little trouble hearing you.
Sorry, I'm reading. I'll start again. This is the Zoom universe where it's not always totally stable. Ivica says, I would also like to appreciate how you highlighted the need for creating a global network, as well as the importance of addressing the goals rather than need. Focuses on a strength perspective. So it's important to appreciate and acknowledge the agency and capacity of adults. And I thank you for that comment. We should finish probably at the end of an hour, which is about 5 minutes. Does anybody else have a comment they'd like to make or a question they'd like to put to Norah?
Just one more comment. I think, I think we need to think about enabling environments, as everybody said. But certainly from my background in nursing, I think we have so much to learn from the tourism industry. And, we did a piece of work asking people in their 80s and 90s what would inhibit or facilitate them going to an art gallery or museum, and they were saying there's so many steps up to the museum thing, or there's a disabled lift. There's such a long way to walk in between exhibits, and we don't want wheelchairs, but why can't we have something like a golf cart, and make it more like a tourist day out than an invalid's day out. And I do think we need to think about enabling.
Well, thank you, Angela. I mean, I think these are the conversations also to have across regions, and across communities that have more or fewer resources, and how do we get that fit calibrated? How do we really? It gets back, doesn't it, to valuing individuals and not looking at disability, and all of these values that I think we give lip service to, we're still not all that good at implementing.
Okay, a last comment or question perhaps from someone who hasn't had a chance to say anything yet. Would someone like to say something?
I think we need to remember who we are, not what we are.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
I was wondering what the young participants are thinking of this conversation. I see Teresa and Heliosa and is it Iteka? Ali, I was just wondering what your views are about what we're saying.
Hello, I'm sorry I was a bit late because I was in another meeting. I'm very happy to be here to watch Norah Keating. And I don't know if you have already discussed that issue, but this is something that is in my mind and I'd like to share with you. I'm Brazilian, I'm from Brazil, and we are just facing a huge political crisis here with the coronavirus. So this political crisis also increase all those inequalities we are discussing here. And my question would be, how do we overcome those inequalities despite the political crisis we are facing? I know it's not Brazil, the only country that is facing this huge political crisis. This is something that impacts on older people. This impacts on my work as a researcher because we have lots of barriers to overcome so we can do research here. And I would like to know what you think about that, Norah. All this political crisis, how can we cope with that?
Well, first, it's lovely to see you again, Eloisa, to see that you are well. I think that's exactly the kind of issue, you know, we as researchers sometimes think we're above all of the politics, but Brazil is in a very difficult situation with political crisis, with high rates of COVID. These are difficult times. I think that's where, whenever possible, we need to connect with others within our own regions to think about what are the questions we are going to answer, presuming that these crises won't go on forever. I wish I could help you with the political crisis, but I can't. But what I can do, if after the session you would contact me, is connect you with a newly formed group called the Latin American Social Issues on Aging that are getting together around some of these issues of how are our contexts important and what are the kinds of capacities we need to build. So do get in touch with me and I'll connect you with them.
Okay, I will. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's very nice to see you.
You too.
Just thank you everybody for being here, and thank you, Norah, for your contribution to the conference, and a lot of big picture things to think about, and yeah, there was some great questions got asked afterwards. So we've got to keep on struggling with these questions and struggling with the issues. So thank you very much, everybody, for being here. This session has been recorded, so it will be online if you want to go back over it or refer it to some other people. So thanks very much, everybody.
My pleasure, everybody. Thank you.
Bye then.
Thanks, everyone.